All right, now let me take you through some issues that often come up. So I've already talked about this first bullet. Can you achieve the research objectives without this question? Exactly what are you going to do with it? How is this going to help me make a decision? These are questions that you should be asking yourself about every question on your survey. I've already hinted at the second bullet as well. So make sure that the language of the survey is what your target audience understands. So one of the most common problems in this area is using marketing speak. So as professional marketers, we say stuff like, well, how's Target positioned relative to Walmart? Well, normal people don't talk that way. And if you use this language, then your consumers are going to get confused. So the way you avoid this problem is through pretesting. The meaning of the words should be clear. So how many members are there in your family? Sounds like a good question, but it really isn't. What do you mean by family? So if you're a college student and you're away from home, do your parents who don't live with you count? If you're 20-something, are you going to count your parents as your family? Well, family is one of these words that can mean different things in different contexts. Yeah, my mom's part of my family, but it's kind of, she doesn't live with me. So, what does that mean? All right, so you want to be really clear about that. How many members are there in your household would be a better question. What's your income? Another question. So, do you mean your personal income? Is it your household income? Do you use product X regularly? The problem here is the word regularly. Different people will assign a different meaning to regularly. To some people, going out to eat once a week is a regular occurrence, whereas to other people, once a week is pretty rare. So if people have a different meaning of regularly, in effect, they're answering different questions and you're just getting noise. Avoid double-barreled questions. So double-barreled questions are questions that ask two things at the same time. So do you believe that McDonald's has fast and courteous service? Sounds innocent enough, but what happens if I think the service at McDonald's is fast, but they're rude? How do I answer that then? Or if I think it's slow, but they're very courteous, but they're just really slow. So I'm not sure how to answer it if I agree with one part of it. So the way you avoid these issues is you split it up into two questions. Do you think it's fast? Do you think it's courteous is a separate question. Another issue that often comes up, this kind of related to using marketing lingo. Often we make assumptions that consumers know stuff that they may not know. So if you ask a question and the consumers really don't have enough information to answer it, they'll probably give you an answer, and that answer is just complete rubbish because they're making stuff up, and what they make up, who knows. All right, so here's a kind of a famous example. There was a survey done asking about the opinion of the National Bureau of Customer Complaints. And a majority of people gave an opinion about the National Bureau of Customer Complaints. The only problem is this bureau doesn't exist. So the correct answer should be never heard of it. But if you ask someone for an opinion, they'll give it to you, and God only knows what they're basing that on. They might be basing it on experiences with other national bureaus that they may have had contact with, and so you're just getting noise if people don't have the right information. Avoid negatives and avoid double negatives because they're likely to be misunderstood. So students should not be required to take a comprehensive exam to graduate, or it is not a good idea not to turn in homework on time, and you got to process through all those negatives, and chances are some of your respondents are going to get confused. Avoid leading or loaded questions. We've already talked a little bit about this. So a leading question leads the respondent to one answer or another. So if you ask, do you think that the U.S. should allow public speeches, you're leading them to allow it. Do you think they should forbid it? You're leading them to forbid it. You give them the same response scale, you get very different answers. In a couple of weeks, we're going to talk about customer satisfaction questions. If you ask how satisfied are you with your car versus how dissatisfied you are with your car, give them exactly the same scale points, you get very different answers. Here's just a few other questions that are leading. So what did you dislike about the product you just tried? Well, the problem with this is you're assuming that there was something about the product they didn't like. Now, maybe I loved the product, and if you ask me this question, then I'm going to have to, I'm going to have to think of something, even if I really liked it. So a better way to do this is to ask whether there's any aspect that I didn't like. If so, tell me about it. Do you think that Johnson & Johnson did everything possible? Well, everything possible is a very high standard, so that's not a very good question. Looks like something a competitor might ask and then say, well, no, they didn't do everything possible. It's a rubbish company. Avoid complex questions. So of the total number of miles you drove to work during the past month, approximately what percentage was driving to and from work? So you'd be better off asking how many miles did you drive to work, how many miles did you drive in total, then you can compute that percentage yourself. Response categories should not overlap. So what's your age? Well, if I'm 30 years old, which box do I check? Not quite sure. Avoid open-ended questions. What do you like best about the product? All right, well, these are somewhat problematic questions. Some researchers like them. I think they're a pretty bad idea for the following reason. Requires a lot more effort, a lot more processing for the consumer to answer one of these open-ended questions, as opposed to agreeing or disagreeing with a series of Likert scales. They are really hard to code. So if you get a bunch of text responses, it's a lot of work to. People will use synonyms to mean the same thing, and you're going to have to figure that out. Respondents will give different levels of detail. One person might not be into your survey much, and they list the first thing that comes to mind. You get someone else who's going to list 5 things. Now, if that first person had really thought about it, they might agree with some of those other things. They just don't want to write that much. Okay, so again, if you have these structured questions on Likert scales, you make them answer all of them, then it's like you have a common set of questions across all subjects. Whereas if I'm only going to give you one thing, even if I think of 3 or 4, it's not like I'm taking the same survey then. So if a respondent doesn't mention something, is that because the respondent forgot about it? Or is that because because that thing wasn't important? You can't answer that question with these open-ended things, whereas with structured questions you can. The way you should handle this is by doing in-depth qualitative research. Do some in-depth interviews or focus groups and use that to develop a battery of structured questions that everybody then answers. So everybody's answering the same questions. Another kind of piece of advice, when appropriate, allow for not applicable. So this is one of my favorite questions. I did some work for a healthcare marketing research firm for a while. And one of the questions on there was, how satisfied or dissatisfied are you, so we didn't lead them, with the gynecological services of your healthcare provider? Now, that's a great question, but if you're a guy, you don't really have much of an answer to that. So you want to allow for opting out. So I have no experience with this, so I'm not going to answer. Again, if you ask people for an opinion, they'll give you one even if they have no experience with it. So that brings us to, how do you let people opt out? So there are 3 different formats. The standard format is you include don't know. Well, all right, so the standard format is you don't let them opt out. So here's kind of a famous example of this. Do you agree or disagree that Russian leaders are basically trying to get along with America? And you give them an agree-disagree anchored scale. You can give a quasi-filter. So you give them an extra box saying don't know. And then the full filter is you first ask whether they have an opinion about this. And if they say yes, then you ask the question. So what you're going to see is that you get pretty different answers to this question depending on whether you let people opt out. So with no opinion, only 14% opt out. If you give the full filter, 56% don't have an opinion. You get fairly similar responses using the quasi-filter or the full filter, but you get pretty different responses using that standard where you don't allow them to opt out. So, at the bare minimum, give a opt out, don't know, not applicable category as one of the responses. Avoid implied assumptions. So, you in favor of requiring all new refrigerators built with the most efficient insulation available? Well, who's going to disagree with that? But you really need to provide information to make a reasonable decision on that. So even if it's going to mean a 25% increase in the retail price, you're going to get very different answers if you divulge that additional piece of information. There's also issues with order biases. So if you have a number of response categories and you say something like check all that apply, a problem that comes up is that the order that you give those response categories will affect how often people check them. Very often, those that are towards the top of the list get checked more than those towards the bottom of the list. The solution to this, and it's implemented by a lot of vendors, is to randomize the order of those response categories. So here's a famous example of this. So 6 studies were conducted where respondents were asked to rate the effectiveness of these three aspirins, and you'll see very different responses depending on which one was asked first. So if you ask Tylenol first, it doesn't do as well. You ask Tylenol later, it does a bit better. All right, so the way to avoid this then is to randomize the order of these on the survey. So software, internet surveys, phone surveys make this real easy to do, harder to do with paper surveys. There's a little joke that I really like about question wording. You can read it on your own. Are these good questions? We'll discuss this in class or on our discussion board. One more issue that comes up with questionnaire wording. You're going to need to order the questions. So the first thing that you want to do on a survey is to get the screening questions out of the way. So remember, screening questions test whether or not a person is in the population, the target population or universe that you're studying. So if you're studying females between the ages of 25 and 40, you want to have a screening question in there that measures what is your gender, what is your age, and then if a respondent doesn't fall into that category, you terminate the interview, you thank the person and terminate. Start zippy. So you want questions that are going to pique their interest, because if you ask a bunch of boring questions or a bunch of really hard questions, that consumer is not going to have a real positive attitude towards your survey. So you want to get them thinking about stuff they care about. People often really care a lot about products because they talk to someone about how much they love Apple, or so if you get them talking about something that they really care about, and that's usually what our surveys are about in marketing. That's going to give them a positive feeling that's going to carry them through the survey. So you want to start out with questions that they're going to find interesting. The general rule within a section, you want to start general, get them thinking about the topic, and then kind of narrow down and get more specific. You don't want to put difficult or personal questions at the beginning. You want to put them towards the end. So one reason for this is if you ask me a bunch of personal questions, I might decide to terminate the interview because I don't want to answer all these questions. So if you ask the stuff at the beginning, then you lose all my responses. If you've asked me all the other stuff first, you have those responses before I terminate. This also gives respondents a chance to get comfortable, to kind of build some trust with you before you get to the more personal questions. So put all the demographics and sensitive questions at the end.